Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Thank you for coming along today to our third Spotlight webinar in the Spotlight series. This one is on long-term disaster impacts on education outcomes, a really important topic for us to be sort of thinking about. My name is John Richardson. I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to be your host for this afternoon in this what promises to be a really fascinating webinar. I wish to start beforehand by acknowledging that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nation, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you may all join us from, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us in this event. I'm paying respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that the 65,000 years that the original systems thinkers, the Indigenous people, have lived with natural hazards, and there's certainly much I think we can learn from their accumulated wisdom as we face increasingly sort of complex challenges in uncertain times. So moving on, before we get into the business of the afternoon, a few housekeeping things that we always sort of cover off on, so before, so we just wanted to let you know that today's event will be recorded and will be made available along with the slides after the event. And this will come through in updates from ADA, so make sure you subscribe to updates from ADA, and you'll be able to get the recording through there. We will be using the Q&A function today on Zoom. So if you have a question, then please put it in the Q&A function and not in the chat, because in the chat it can sometimes get lost. You'll be able to upvote any questions. That certainly helps me in prioritising them, particularly when we get lots of questions. So if there's just one there that you think, yeah, I'd really like to hear this one, please upvote it. But use the chat window to share any thoughts that you might have, or any reflections. This is one great way that we can have a sort of conversation in the background and in what is going on in what you're hearing. But I would like to sort of remind you that please be respectful to each other and our presenters when posting your comments or your questions. The other thing to also be mindful of is some of the content that we speak about today may be distressing or bring up prior experiences. And in that instance, please use any techniques that you may have developed to help you through adverse reactions. As you listen to today's presenters, we'd also like you to start to think about, what does this content mean to you? How can you apply the learnings in your role? And perhaps, what action you might take. What simple action might you take when you leave the webinar at the end? So just a little bit of homework to sort of start to think about. So moving on to why are we here? The first episode of the ABC Big Weather series from a number of years ago, I had Craig Roycastle visiting school kids in the western suburbs of Sydney, and they were in an overheated classroom and trying to learn, and you could just see how challenging that was, and certainly for some of us, certainly brought back some probably very stressful sort of childhood experiences of overheated classrooms. Sustainable Development Goal 4 ensures that we have an inclusive and equitable quality education system and promote lifelong learning for all. And so this goal is a recognition as a global community that we value education. Completing school education allows people to access stable and higher quality jobs. It's linked with lower adult mortality and longer and healthier lives civic participation, lower rates of crime, lower rates of poverty. It matters for the nations as well in terms of thinking about higher levels of secondary completion rates, experience stronger rate levels of growth. So we can see that education is important for societal outcomes. According to the ABS, there's over 4.2 million school students in Australia and over 9,600 schools. 81% of us finish year 12. There's around $85 billion invested annually in schools education. So it's a significant amount of investment that we make as a nation. If we think about risks and consequences systematically, we can see that disruption to education can have long-term consequences on people's lives and on society. So thinking about this and sort of recognising that education outcomes are really important. This is one of the reasons why we thought, because we don't necessarily see them included in planning for disasters or planning for risk reduction. It wasn't one of the critical systems at risk in the first National Climate Risk Assessment. And so we wanted to sort of draw people's attention to this so that you can be starting to sort of think about this as you might be you might be planning to reduce disaster risk, you might be thinking about how you effectively respond and recover. So that's enough from me. I now would like to hand over to the first of our speakers, Konstantina Vasilakopoulou, who's an architect and a sustainability expert whose work focuses on the built environment and the impacts of inclusivity on vulnerable populations. Konstantina, over to you.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm sorry that I have such a long and complicated name. I will speak today about the results of a systematic review that we finished around June 2025 with Professor Matt Santamouris from UNSW Sydney, and it is on the cumulative exposure to heat and student cognitive and academic performance. Next slide, please. So, as we all know, our planet is getting warmer and our cities are getting very, very warm. There are more than 13,000 cities that have extreme temperatures during the summer months today, nowadays. High temperatures have significant impacts on our lives and on our bodies. They affect our health. They can increase our irritability and they can cause violent incidents. They reduce our productivity and they might reduce our income. But heat also can affect our cognitive performance, especially if we belong to a vulnerable population group, like if we are older people or if we are children. Next slide, please. So researchers have tried to identify the effects of heat on cognitive performance of students, and most of the studies examine the impact of momentary exposure to high temperatures based on experimental or statistical approaches. So experimental studies go into a classroom and they control the temperature. They have low temperatures or high temperatures, and they give some cognitive tests to the students, and they assess the results in these tests depending on the temperature, and they're associated with the temperature. On the other hand, statistical and epidemiological studies consider much larger populations, and they compare the results of, let's say, national tests or more standardized tests like NAPLAN tests in Australia, and they associate them with environmental temperatures in different areas. Unlike momentary studies, which focus on the immediate effects of temperature on cognitive performance, long-term studies examine the sustained impacts of heat exposure across 1 or more years. Next slide, please. So that's what we wanted to explore in our systematic review. We wanted to explore the long-term exposure to high temperatures and how this impacts academic and cognitive performance of students. And we had 4 main research questions. What are the effects of long-term exposure to heat on academic performance? If environmental overheating disproportionately affects the academic performance of specific social groups? What are the adaptation strategies that have been proven to mitigate the effects of this exposure? And what are the future projections regarding the effects of environmental overheating on academic performance? And there are not many papers on the long-term exposure of students. We found 6 papers that we could include in our systematic review. These 6 papers were describing 7 studies. And the students that were considered by these studies were coming from primary schools, colleges, high schools, colleges, universities, so the whole range of students. And we selected studies that reported analysis and results on very high number of students, typically several thousand students. And all types of cognitive functions and tasks were included in the analysis. Next slide, please. So this table provides an overview of the studies that were included in the review. As you can see, we have large populations. So the smallest population that we had was 8,000 students, and the total population considered by the whole review was more than 13 million students. These studies consider standardized tests. They were not, let's say, some cognitive tests that the researchers were giving to the students or the tests that teachers might give to their students. They were all standardized national or district tests. And by taking, let's say, weather data 1 to 5 years before the test, the studies ensured that they were looking into the long-term effect of heat on academic performance. And lastly, I should mention that the studies that we included had significant effects on the students. We didn't search only for effect on a small part of the students. They needed to, let's say, find a significant effect. Next slide, please. So I know it's many numbers, but I wanted to give you some bullet points from each of these studies that we analyzed. So the first study was conducted in US population and found that 0.5 degree Celsius higher average temperature in 1 year can lower the following year's test scores by 0.2% of a standard deviation, or a little less than 1% of year's learning. It was also found that each day with temperature above 32 degrees Celsius lowers the year's learning by 0.17% compared to school days with average temperature of 16 degrees Celsius. The impact was also found to be cumulative. So, for example, 4 years of high temperatures will add up, the effect will add up, and they will have a more significant effect than 1 year of high temperatures. And hot summers and weekends, when students do not go to school and usually do not learn, found to have little impact on academic performance. Next slide, please. The second study, which was performed on Indian students, found that each additional day with temperature above 29 degrees in the previous year lowered the maths and reading performance by 0.002 and 0.003 standard deviations, respectively, in the next year. And also the impact of high temperature was greater on more difficult questions in maths and reading than to the easier questions. Next slide, please. So in the third study, the researchers performed the same analysis in a number of countries and then on US population. In both populations, student cohorts schooled in the same areas, in the same schools, would have different performances depending on how hot a year was, and the worst performance would be during the hottest years. It was also found that weekends and summer temperatures had little effect, just like the previous study. In the international cohort, each additional day above, let's say, 27 degrees Celsius during 3 years before an exam lowered scores by 0.18% of a standard deviation. And similarly, in the US study, each additional day with temperature above 27 degrees during the 1 year before the test reduced achievement by approximately 0.07% of a standard deviation. And we also see that the effect on maths was 3 times greater than the effect on English language. Also, in the US cohort, we see that the effect was greater on younger students. They were more affected than the older students. Next slide, please. So the next study is the fourth study, and this is an outlier, if we can say, within the 7 studies that we analyzed, because it found no significant long-term effects of increased temperature on performance. It found a significant short-term effect of high performance on maths. If we have the time later, we can discuss why this study found no effect. Next slide, please. So the fifth study showed that people living in warmer areas are less affected by temperature increases. For example, if we have an area with average maximum temperature of 13 degrees Celsius, an increase by 0.5 degree Celsius decreased the average score by 4.7%. While the same increase of 0.5 degree Celsius in an area with average maximum temperature of 24 caused a decrease of 2.6%. The same study showed that each additional day with temperatures above 37.7, so extremely hot days, decreases the student achievement by 2.3%. Next slide, please. Similarly, the last study showed that each additional day with maximum temperature above 34 degrees, again an extremely hot day, decreased math scores by 0.004 standard deviations and English scores by 0.006 standard deviations. This effect was calculated to be similar as increasing a class size by 2 to 3 students during years 4 to 6. Here, this study showed that hot summers had greater effects on the test scores of students who lived in relatively cooler cities, like we saw before. Next slide, please. So we saw a little bit what our studies, the studies that we analyzed show, and it's time to talk about what strategies we can adopt to improve academic scores and reduce the impact of very high temperatures on our students' performance. All the studies that we found mention the presence and the use of air conditioning in classrooms. And we will discuss a little bit about this. And this is an environmental measure, but we also have other things that we can do and other ways that we can help students. For example, with optimized airflow rates, with personalized ventilation systems, clothing, and of course, urban heat mitigation measures, which means that we can build our cities or modify our cities, let's say, in ways where we keep the temperatures around our schools and around our homes lower. But we can also adopt passive cooling techniques for our school buildings. However, if I go back to air conditioning, we have to understand that we should be very careful when we prescribe air conditioning or more air conditioning, increasing the use of air conditioning in classrooms, because studies show mixed results. The performance might improve, but we might have other negative effects. One of them could be environmental dissatisfaction, but that's not the only problem. If we go to the next slide, I want to highlight that one of the main problems with using more conditioning in our classrooms is that we reduce natural ventilation. We have lower ventilation rates in our classrooms. And lower ventilation rates in the classrooms increase CO2 concentrations. And our research shows that low ventilations and high CO2 concentrations are associated with reduced cognitive performance. And the opposite, when we increase ventilation and we lower CO2, we have better outcomes. So we must be really careful when we are, let's say, prescribing or encouraging the use of air conditioning in our classrooms. Next slide, please. There are, of course, other ways that we can help students, and sports science has provided evidence that cooling our bodies and our heads can, depending on the task, improve our working memory, for example. There are other cultural changes or habits that we can adopt so that children are protected from the heat, but also subsequent investments that partially or fully offset the short-run effects, minimizing their enduring impact and not allowing the impact to add up. Next slide, please. So a big question posed by these studies is whether everyone is equally affected by exposure to heat. That's a very important problem, and the answer is no, not everyone is affected the same way. Students from families with lower income live in warmer areas, in houses and schools that may not have air conditioning or that may not be able to use the air conditioning as much as other families. So they're exposed to more heat than, let's say, wealthier students. Moreover, the opportunities to compensate for the loss through private tutoring or at school could be limited. And from the examples I have on the right, I will also only mention the one including Australia. Disadvantaged households in USA, Australia, and Europe can live in neighborhoods that can be up to 6 degrees hotter and have less greenery than the neighborhoods where wealthier people live. So the children in these neighborhoods are expected to learn less, and not because we are teaching or they're being taught less. Next slide, please. Finally, what are the future projections about this problem? Since our world is unfortunately continuing to get warmer, the estimates for the cognitive and academic performance of students are not encouraging. I will only mention the impacts to Indian students because I think it's fair, because their per capita emissions are much lower than the global average. So by the end of the century, the expected temperature increase would decrease reading and mathematics scores by 0.03 and 0.04 standard deviations each year, which corresponds to an equivalent of nearly 2 years in a person's education. It is also estimated that the potential rise in hot days by 10 in a year could result in a 3% decrease in wages. So what's happening here is that we are penalizing the people who are contributing the least to the problem of climatic change. Next slide, please. So what do we know? We know that temperature during school time plays a decisive role in academic performance, while the temperature during the weekends or school holidays doesn't play such an important role. Long-term exposure to heat has a greater impact on cognitive performance of younger students and on students that live in less advantaged areas, let's say. Performance of complex tasks is more affected, and individuals living in warmer climates are better acclimatized, and they're not that affected and not as much as people who live in cooler areas. And what don't we know? People who live, research that compares people working in air-conditioned environments and naturally ventilated environments show that people working in environments with natural ventilation are better acclimatized in heat. So we should be very careful with the use of air conditioning in our schools. And the last thing I'm going to say is that when we are considering the environment of our classrooms, we should take all parameters into consideration, not only heat, lighting, ventilation, all the environment plays an important role. That's all for me. I'm sorry if I took more of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantina. That was certainly fascinating and a lot there to take on and for us to be thinking about. I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, Professor Alisha Gibbs, who's the Director of the Disaster, Climate and Adversity Unit at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. And so she's going to take us through some longer-term research that she's been involved in leading around bushfires and COVID and others. So over to you, Lisa.
Great. Thanks, John. And thanks, Konstantina, as well. I really enjoyed your presentation. Perhaps if we jump to the next slide, please, Charlotte, just to let everyone know, I'm also going to be presenting some evidence, not just the international evidence, but also local findings from a range of our studies conducted with many colleagues and partner organisations relating to Black Saturday bushfires, Black Summer, and the pandemic. And then I'll just finish up with some tips about strategies and resources. Thank you. So I always like to start just with the reminder that most people have incredible capacity to adapt after a disaster event. There's obviously an initial period of distress that comes with all of the things that have to be dealt with in the event itself and the aftermath. But we'd see that people cope in many different ways. But of course, we're here today because there are still a significant number who do need additional support and who are at much higher risk of having long-term impacts. So that's what I'll focus on today. So apologies for skipping the strength-based approach that we normally try and balance with. So just looking at the next slide, my focus in this area really came when I was doing in-depth research following the Black Saturday bushfires, the 2009 bushfires, and spending a lot of time out in communities and started to hear from school principals and teachers and parents about the really profound and prolonged impact on the school community. And if I had to sum it up, I would say that that was represented by a clear shift from a central focus of the school on learning, still taking care of well-being for staff and students, but they're there for a learning purpose. And then that being flipped so that really the central focus just became on trying to restore and maintain well-being. And if learning happens around that, fantastic, but that was a struggle. So that's the context that I want to position this discussion in today. And to do that, I'll begin by presenting some evidence. The international evidence about disaster impacts, if you could move on for me, please, Charlotte. The international evidence about disaster impacts on learning is inconsistent. And so that arises because studies are done in different ways. If you could go to the next slide, please, Charlotte. The focus, well, what we're learning is that it makes a difference whether the disaster occurs during school period or not, and that's come through in Konstantina's evidence as well. It depends on the age of the students, the stage of development and learning, the subject, as we've already heard, and also the socioeconomic circumstances. So, for example, in some low-income countries, students are pulled out of school to help their parents restore their source of income, whether that's farming or another small business endeavour. So the circumstances can vary dramatically. So what I wanted to be able to do to contribute to our communities here in Australia was to build some evidence about what was happening here so that we could use that to guide decision making. And so if you could go to the next slide, what we did was focus on a cohort of students across the whole state. So I'm going to unpack this slide a little bit for you. Those students that we looked at were the students who entered prep the year before the Black Saturday bushfires. So they all started on an equal footing. And then what we were able to do going forward from 2009 was to compare the outcomes for students in bushfire impacted schools compared to non-bushfire impacted schools. And what we found was that their NAPLAN results progressing from grade 3 to grade 5 was showing a pattern of learning delays. So they weren't progressing as you would expect in reading and maths. In the other subjects, we did not see an effect. And I will mention that we did adjust for different circumstances at that school entry point. So these were not huge differences, but they were significant. And of course, we were looking across the state. So what we did was that we then followed those students from grade 5 through to year 7 and year 9. And what we found was that they got back on track in their learning progression, the rate of learning, but they were behind their peers in all subject domains when we look at their results in year 9. So that applied for students in the highly impacted bushfire affected schools at primary level. Of course, they're now all scattered to different secondary schools. For those who are at medium impacted schools, we saw variable results across subjects. So there's a story there in how this plays out in the longer term that we really need to pay attention to. And certainly we found that our Victorian state government and federal government agencies were very interested in these findings and applied them to decision making. So that was really encouraging. If we go to the next slide, it's really important to think about what are the factors influencing those learning outcomes so that their decisions about, well, what do you do to address that is informed by that understanding. So if you just take a moment to think yourself, I would imagine everybody who is attending this event has some skin in the game, has some expertise, some lived or working experience in this space. So you can probably list a range of factors yourself. So if you just think for a moment, what might be influencing learning outcomes that we can potentially alter? So if we go to the next slide, one of the first things, of course, is the student capacity to focus and their interest in learning with all that they've gone through. So this is a student quote in one of our studies. I remember changes all the time after the fires, things changing, doing things on different days and stuff like that. Now this student was about 12, 13 when we interviewed him. He was 8 at the time of the fires. So all these years afterwards, this was a really strong memory for him. Just that sense of never knowing where you're supposed to be at what time because everything is changing. So that's a really profound influence on capacity to focus on learning. The second thing on the next slide, of course, is the potential for mental health impacts from the disaster event itself and what comes after. Children, young people are just as likely as adults to be at risk of these more significant mental health conditions. But it does vary. So you can see here that in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, children experienced that condition at about the same rate as adults and improved at about the same rate. And I haven't explained that this is coming from an international scoping review that we conducted, led by colleagues in WA, and it was a multilingual review. So really gave us insights into longer term mental health trajectories. You can see that in relation to depression, children were more likely to report symptoms of depression after disasters compared to adults, but then improved reasonably rapidly and at the same rate as, and sort of it came down to the same level as adults. The condition of most concern when we're talking about children and young people is anxiety. The international evidence is telling us that they show elevated levels of anxiety, symptoms of anxiety after a disaster, and they tend to be sustained over time. So that's an important area of focus to support well-being and also learning. And of course, that also means that those children, not only are they dealing with potentially those mental health issues themselves, but they are in families and communities where the adults in their lives are also experiencing, in many cases, similar challenges. If we go to the next slide, one of the positives we have to remember is that there's so many lovely examples of community cohesion and social support. So that is present, and we heard many examples of how students were benefiting from those forms of support, from extended family, grandparents, of course, a huge factor, but also community and school levels of support. So that's something that we can absolutely focus on strengthening in the post-disaster environment. If we go to the next one, we also have to be mindful that there is potential exposure to anger and violence. So that's the counterpoint, is that we see elevated levels of both of those elements within communities post-disaster. And next slide, please. And of course, we know that there's a lot of disruption in the home environment, and research conducted by a colleague, Lauren Costa, really showed how parenting is impacted in many different ways. And when we think about learning, not only the emotional element of that is a factor, but also just at a very practical level, parents are much less able to spend time supporting reading as a leisure activity or as a learning activity, and supporting homework. And of course, there's often a loss of actual books and resources because of damage to home and property. So the next slide, please. And school staff. School staff are there to support student learning, but they're also affected themselves. And this quote from a teacher in one of our studies said, it's so hard to look after yourself when you're thrust into that position, because you know that you should be looking after yourself, but you also know your prime thing is to look after everybody else. And we see absolute levels of altruism in teachers in our studies. And so after the Black Summer bushfires and the COVID pandemic, when there was a ban on research being conducted in schools, we said to the Department of Education here in Victoria, who we were collaborating with, we really encouraged them to just have a look at what was happening in terms of wellbeing for staff and students. And so if you go to the next slide, please, Charlotte, you'll see that we did a joint project with the department to access some data that's automatically collected in schools for student connectedness and school satisfaction, and we conducted staff wellbeing surveys. And just the key takeaways on the next slide, you can see that key areas of concern were that secondary students had really markedly low wellbeing compared to pre-pandemic levels. So these were secondary students in bushfire affected schools. We weren't allowed to capture that in comparison schools, but the low school connectedness scores were greater than other schools that were pandemic affected, and school staff showed higher levels of psychological distress. So I can see John, and so that tells me that I need to stop at this point. I have slides relating to what can we do in terms of supporting students, and that's at parent level and at school level. We can talk about that in the chat. So I'm going to just ask Charlotte to skip through those for the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Sorry to appear and lurk in your screen. This content is so fascinating. There's so much of it, but we have so little time to fit it all in. So I'm going to move on now and introduce our last two speakers, Dr. Sharleen Keleher and Alisha Chand, who are going to, I suppose, pick up where you left off, Lisa, and think about, so we've set up the problem, what's at risk, what's the problem, and this is sort of where we can start to think, so what can we do about it? So over to you, Sharleen and Alisha.
Thanks very much, John, and also to Konstantina and Lisa. I could have listened to you for a lot longer as well, but hopefully this will help wrap up and give you some things to ponder as we move through. So my name's Sharleen Keleher. I am one of the Birdies Tree team members from the Queensland Centre for Perinatal and Infant Mental Health. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So, months after significant flooding in her community, a 2-year-old girl in an early childhood setting watches clouds gather and asks, "Big clouds? Rainy? Flood?" A student in Kawanyama describing what it is like to try to learn when the school's air conditioning breaks down, the windows are boarded shut, and the bubblers don't work. These children are telling us exactly what disasters do to their learning, to their ability to concentrate, to feel safe, to show up ready to learn. They're telling us if we have create the conditions to hear them. Next slide, please. I want to draw your attention to the quotes on this slide from a deputy principal, and particularly what she is and isn't describing. She isn't describing what happened during a disaster. She's describing what she sees on ordinary school days long after the event is over. When rain is forecast, attendance drops. Not in response to a flood, in response to the possibility of rain. And that's because the community's bodies and minds are still living with that previous experience of a disaster. She notes, "We haven't officially tracked that, but staff are noticing over time." Next slide, please. Disaster systems are designed to respond to what's visible. Today, I want to also highlight what they miss and what that costs children. Next slide. Disasters don't occur in isolation, and they don't affect children in isolation either. When a disaster hits, it ripples through every layer of a child's world, directly through what the child experiences, and indirectly through their family, their early learning service or school, their community. Next slide. In my work with early childhood educators, the same patterns emerge after every disaster. Children who have been settling well, becoming anxious and withdrawn, sleep disrupted at home and at early learning, flowing directly into their capacity to learn. What we know is that these impacts begin long before a child ever reaches an early learning service. The QF 2011 flood study found that prenatal flood stress had measurable effects on infants' cognitive, motor, and language development, and that was measured over a period of 4 years after the event. These are the very foundations children need for school readiness. And the effects don't stop there. Dr. Nikki Tridigal's Queensland research found that children who have been exposed to floods as infants arrived at prep years later experiencing executive functioning challenges. And this aligns with the research and stories I'm hearing from educators and from the most recent AEDC data collection in 2024, where we're seeing increasing developmental vulnerabilities in areas associated with emotional maturity and language and cognitive skills. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So this slide maps some of the evidence of disaster impacts associated with children's learning outcomes. I want to acknowledge the evidence base that Konstantina and Lisa have already spoken to, and also Lisa's point regarding the inconsistency and complexity within the international and Australian evidence on disaster impacts for education. So on this slide on the left, I've noted some of the seen impacts, what disaster systems count and respond to. On the right are examples of the unseen impacts, which are sometimes recognised at different levels, but they're often not directly connected to the disaster event and may not be directly addressed in disaster response and recovery programs. The children born during the 2011 Queensland floods are now entering their final years of high school. The data on their educational trajectories does exist in NAPLAN, in attendance records, in AEDC and LSAT cohort data. And as you've just heard from Konstantina and Lisa, there are pockets of research that are looking into this. But that complexity of understanding both the direct and indirect impacts of disaster on children's learning means that we still lack a systematic, coordinated approach that routinely connects that data to children's disaster experience across the sector and across time. I also want to note that the evidence shows us that when children have access to genuine opportunities to build their knowledge about disasters and exercise their agency, anxiety reduces, learning deepens, and learning communities become stronger. As Bryony Towers' research in disaster-affected school communities demonstrates, and what we're also seeing in the Birdies Tree program, this isn't just a future possibility. These are examples of what's already happening in the education space, having real impacts for children's learning and highlight an opportunity for us to strengthen. Next slide, please. So where does that leave us? We're not starting from zero. We have some evidence to build on. We have a workforce already embedded in every disaster-affected community who are holding children and families through recovery. And programs like Birdies Tree are building that workforce's capacity before, during, and after disasters. So, what does a coordinated systems level response look like? In Queensland, we're developing one, and I'm handing to Alisha now, who will take you through this.
Thanks, Sharleen. Hello, my name is Alisha Chand, and I have the great pleasure of convening the Thriving Kids in Disaster Alliance, which is an initiative of Queensland Kids Partnerships. Next slide, please. And then again, sorry, Charlotte. Thriving Kids in Disaster, or T-Kids for short, was established in 2023 with support from the John Villiers Trust in response to the growing impact of disasters on infants, children, young people and caregivers. This is particularly clear here in Queensland, where since 2021, every local government area has experienced at least one disaster activation. Next slide, please, Charlotte. Informed by neurodevelopmental science from the Harvard Center of the Developing Child, we use ARACE's NEST framework and the resilience scale to understand how adversity, in this case particularly extreme weather conditions and disasters, disrupt children's bodies and brain development, how it increases stress, and how it destabilizes family and communities, as we've heard from all of our speakers today. All of this can ultimately impact on learning, development, and participation of children and young people. These frameworks highlight the critical role of the protective factors that we can do to strengthen coping skills, support the development, and buffer adversities during and after disaster. Next slide, please. As we've discussed here today, the Thriving Kids in Disaster suite of evidence also showed a clear gap in what we know about the long-term learning and educational impacts for children and young people. And this makes it harder to design system responses that support children and young people beyond immediate recovery. This information has directly impacted and informed the co-development of our action and investment plan, which takes a whole-of-system approach and translates evidence into clear priorities and coordinated actions, and brings together investors and delivery partners to seed, test, and scale initiatives that strengthen outcome for children and families. Today, I'm going to very quickly go through a couple of examples of how, working with our partners, we're able to turn this plan into action. Next slide, please. Here you'll see our first example of our T-Kids in Place and disaster coaching program. To support the development of those protective factors that we've all been speaking about today, at an everyday systems level, we use a place-based approach where we focus on building capability across workforces and ecosystems. This is done through our T-Kids in Place and disasters coaches program by joining up sectors such as emergency services, health, education, housing, and community members, and working on this as a whole. You'll see in this picture at the Delvine Emergency Services Wellbeing Day, you can see how our work is supporting local disaster and recovery and resilience workforces. We work on coaching, training, mentoring, and advocating, where we're able to support these people to increase their confidence and capability in developing these. In this photo, you'll see that there's kids and primary school teachers meeting with local disaster and emergency services, the Delvine Community Hall committee members, the Red Cross, RFDS, Birdie's Tree, and others to build relationships of trust and highlight and expand on what people already know about weather in activities such as the tree, the bee, and you and me. Many of the children that you see in these photos are impacted by the lingering effects of the bushfires that affected them in 2023. Next slide, please. In our work, our coach, our T-Kids coach, Anita Eggington, works with local services and disaster management partners to build their confidence and capability to support this work and embed it into everyday practice. Here you can see Lachlan, who's working alongside young people in Kawanyama and building on the strong relationships, on their strong relationships with place, and explore what they already know about their environments. By using the Big Map process, they look at how extreme weather and disasters affect their community and share what they need to feel safe, supported, and able to learn. These young people are already playing an important role by orientating and advising new teachers and service providers to their community about how the weather, such as cyclones, move through and impact daily life. Their insights are highlighting the risks to their learning, their well-being, and increasing they also have talked about the increasing issues that they experience, such as school infrastructure maintenance affecting their learning and their ability to learn. This knowledge is now informing the Council's new youth strategy. Next slide, please. Through our T-Kids in Place and coaching work, we get to speak to a lot of kids of different ages, their caregivers, and people who provide services to them. Some of the notable things that we've heard from kids include that kids that are living in boarding school need support and connection during disasters, that kids want to be involved in the designing and upgrading of infrastructure like schools. Young people can get involved in local disaster training like the PCYC Emergency Services Cadet Program, and children can be involved in designing disaster kits like the Red Cross Pillowcase Project. Next slide, please. These are just a few of the examples that we've identified and worked with in our communities. Our second example is that of looking at schools. We know that schools are critical social infrastructure, and as climate risk grows, making sure schools are designed and operating for resilience really matters. It helps communities recover faster, protect important assets, and to support better long-term learning and well-being. A great example of this is the Queensland Government Flood Resilience Program, led by Kat Klein and her team, which is focused on building disaster resilience into schools and education infrastructure. The program understands that children can only learn when they feel safe, calm, and connected, like we've heard from everyone today. By strengthening the environment around them, they're also able to strengthen relationships, have consistency, and we are able to increase carer capacity. And ultimately, by putting these things together, we're able to support learning outcomes even in the face of disruption. Next slide, please. Our third and final example today is of bringing practical systems, a practical systems approach that comes through our RACI and UNICEF connections with the State of Australia's Children team. Through the TKED Alliance, we're connecting Kat and her team with the RACI and UNICEF team as their flood resilience work directly informs an upcoming deep dive paper that they're doing at the moment on climate resilience and early childhood education and infrastructure that will be published later this year. This is incredibly important, as Lisa was talking about, and having those collaborations, because this will bring together research, data, policy and practice, and will help to clearly link at a national level the evidence and the climate resistance infrastructure that we'll need to support children's development and learning outcomes. Final slide, please. We thank everyone for joining us today. We do not know all the answers. We are in the moment. We are learning how to best connect the best evidence and the best community approaches together. But collaboratively and coming together, we have a stronger chance of making some ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Alisha. Thank you, Sharleen. That was again fantastic to look at the breadth of what you've been working with in Queensland, and certainly the steps you're sort of taking to look at that in a really systematic and systems way to address these issues. Unfortunately, we're at time because we've had such fantastic presentations today. So there aren't any questions anyway. So, but you know, as you walk away, you might think, okay, well, how might I start to think of applying this to my work? And you might be thinking it's not necessarily directly, because probably a lot of people here from schools. So, you know, you're already potentially exposed to this, but think about if you're a local government planner, you're a health service planner, or you might be an emergency services planner, thinking about how this might kind of reflect in the planning work that you do, so you can support, as Alisha said, the critical social infrastructure that schools are and the role that they play in communities. So as I said, that's all we've got time for today. So I do want to thank Konstantina, Alisha, and Sharleen for bringing their knowledge research to us. As you leave, as I said, think about the one thing that you'll do. Feel free to pop it in the chat if you want to. I'd like to thank Charlotte Fell, Maida Rashid, and Angela Draper for their work behind the scenes on making this webinar really, really important. So it's important, but it's happen. I'm just the guy who gets to stand up at the front and sort of fluff my lines. I'd like to also acknowledge the support of the National Emergency Management Agency, who bring this webinar to you through us. And just a kind of a plug for our next webinar. It'll be the 7th webinar in the Resilience Matters series, which will be the role of local government in disaster risk reduction. So you can register for that webinar, which will be on Tuesday, the 14th of April, from 1 until 2 p.m. When you leave today, we will ask you to go to a short survey just to make sure that we capture some insights and are we sort of meeting your needs and any suggestions for the future. Thanks on behalf of Ada for joining us today. It's certainly been my pleasure to host you, and until next time, stay well.